Welcome to today's webinar surrounding the topic of maximizing Marketo and Salesforce synchronization. So today we're going to go through, the main challenges, some of the common issues with Marketo and Salesforce CRM synchronization. We're going to talk a little bit about custom objects and velocity scripting, an area where often we get this myth around customized Salesforce is a problem and we can't do too much with it. We're also going to look a little bit about campaign sync between the two platforms, when and how and what's the right way to do it. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end. For those of you who haven't seen my face in one of these webinars so far, I'm James Fletcher, the CEO and a Marketo Solutions Architect here at JTF Marketing. And I'll be taking you through this topic today. As I mentioned, any questions you've got, pop them into the Q&A, throw them into the chat, or if you want to, talk to us on social media, we'll be happy to answer any of those questions. A little bit of background on JTF Marketing. We've been around for coming up to 7 years. We specialize purely in Marketo and its surrounding technology partners. We've spent quite a lot of our time over the last 7 years developing a range of consultancy services, support services for businesses using Marketo, and importantly, training, education, and also data hygiene and management solutions and integrations. You'll see on the screen some names that you might be familiar with. You may have seen some of these before. Some of you are even on the call, so thank you for joining. And we've worked with a range of industries, so of all sizes, companies, tech startups, through to your global organizations. The challenges remain the same when it comes to Marketo. How do we maximize our investment? How do we get the most out of the technology? And how do we get it to work? How do we make our lives easy, right? This is what automation was meant to be. So let's jump straight into common issues with Salesforce and Marketo. And I'd love to see any additional ones thrown into the chat, or even a hell yes or a yes on the chat, just to see whether we're all here and alive at the end of the day. One of the biggest constraints for a lot of marketers is trying to get these lists to match, right? We've got a database full in Salesforce that we're trying to get into a campaign, but the numbers don't match. There's duplicate contacts firing around. We've got campaigns that aren't being created when we try and push them in from Marketo, which then affects how we attribute marketing success. Of course, customized CRM, you might have even been told by Marketo, some of our customers have, that a customized CRM won't work with Marketo, or your customized CRM won't work with Marketo. And I'll try and demyth that in a second. Of course, you might have regular data failures based on validation rules. So information not going in, country doesn't exist, code is wrong, the state is different, whatever it might be. Again, we can look at those. Or you might even have some records that won't even sync. I've seen this many times where you get records in from CRM and you can't push them back with any intelligence, not even a single update. So again, we can talk about that. Marketo Sales Insight doesn't populate. This is common as well. If you're using Marketo Sales Insight for your sales team or your business development team, get insight into what is marketing doing and what are the campaigns that I have to hand. We see this as a common issue. Now, you may be sitting here agreeing with some of these issues. You may have others. Again, as I say, feel free to throw them into the chat. I want to really make sure that this session is helpful and answer some of your questions. Now, a recently released update from Marketo back in probably now the springtime was the sync status and sync errors page. And we'll jump into this in a little bit more detail and talk about how does it work, how does it hang together, how do you use it. But ultimately, this is really, really important. If you've got sync errors, it will point you in the direction that you need to be headed. Again, there's a couple of areas that we can look at and understand. Is this the place we need to be looking, or do we need to be looking at something else? You can get to this page if you're logged into your Marketo now by visiting Admin, Salesforce, and then click on the Sync Status tab here at the top, or the Sync Error tab. Second thing I want to cover off today is please subscribe to your notification center in Marketo. You probably have never ever used it if you're fairly new to Marketo, or maybe even if you've been around a while. To view them, select this little bell up in the top corner. There is the new task list that's appearing, which we'll do another webinar at some point. And then go through it and find any of the error messages. You can delete these and clear them down. It's a good practice to go through them at least once a week just to check there's nothing in here. And you'll find, as I did when I clicked on mine, I had 176 items I could go through. You'll see here I found a Salesforce Inc. issue where my last name and company name fields are missing. Therefore, I know the reason why this record, or the two records here, haven't synchronized. Now, what I have set up in my instance is I do subscribe to the notification type CRM sync. And again, put in your email address there or a group inbox where you can pick these up and actually work your way through them. Unfortunately, it does require manual manipulation. So if you get lots of them, as we've seen over the years, you will be sitting there updating data manually because there's no other way to overcome some of these challenges depending on your CRM configuration. So let's talk about the number one cause of synchronization issues, and let's call a spade is permission related. Often it's the configuration that's been given to the Marketo sync user, which really, in best practice, we like it to have complete permission over the CRM. Now, I know some of you will be sitting there saying, my IT team will never let me do that, or my CRM manager won't allow me to. Often it's because they don't understand how Marketo works, right? Marketo is feeding you fresh data into your CRM, keeping the data up to date. Maybe it's even email validation rules, right? You're checking whether these email addresses even exist so that you can push them back and say to the business, this data is rubbish, get it out my Marketo system, cut my license fee because I'm not managing so much rubbish data. But ultimately what that sync user really needs is view all, modify all, and delete all on pretty much all objects that it can control, leading contact. For the account, we need view all and modify all. So think about it, if you've got an account field like an industry that you may want to update, you need to map that through. And then on opportunities, we just need to view everything because we can't modify those within Marketo. We'll talk a little bit more about custom objects later on. I'll talk you through an example that we have. Ultimately, anything outside of leading contact is either modify or only view. So custom objects typically are view only. Now, there's one thing to watch out here, and we've just mentioned it when we talk about last name and company. Depending on the validation rules within your Salesforce CRM, you may not be able to override the sync. So you've got to fill in the gaps. You've got to force the sync again in order to get that record through. Now, if you're not seeing all the records in Marketo, that's often because of permissions. So if you've got permission sets in your CRM, which you may not have visibility of, where only the owner can view or modify, et cetera, then that will be why you don't see them in your Marketo instance. Again, I'll echo the point. It should have view all, modify all, delete all permissions where possible, especially for leads. Contact, I know we get into territory of who's the owner, who's the right person. I like all our instances to have that also, because I believe that we as marketing should be updating and modifying this information. Again, I appreciate complex conversation. So let's talk about custom objects. On the right-hand side here, you'll see an example of our own custom objects. We run projects, of course, in the marketing automation consultancy business. We run regular projects for our customers. We have projects associated to opportunities because each opportunity might be a project. And I'll show you in our CRM in a second an example. Now, I've been in so many situations where Marketo's technical team have been unable to support some customizations. And let's keep it really, really simple. When we talk about custom objects in Salesforce and pulling them into Marketo, they must always be linked to a person record, which is the leader of contact. Now that's critical because what we can't do is do, I want to see all projects with contacts that are in Switzerland, for example. It doesn't work that way. We've got to go reverse. We've got to say, show me people in Switzerland with a project object, which is active, for example. And again, I'll show you some more examples of that. The second question we often get asked in this topic is, how do I use the data from these custom objects? Maybe I've got car leasing information or insurance policy information, investment information, purchases online, whatever it might be. Whatever you're storing in those custom objects, you will need to use velocity scripting in order to bring that into your Marketo emails or landing pages. Now, velocity scripting is a coding language. It's JSON. It's a little bit fiddly, actually. It's not something I'm very comfortable with myself, having been around code for a long time. But we've dedicated developers who can help you write those queries and get the data into your email. So very useful, especially when you start thinking about renewals, subscriptions, those kind of things. Super, super useful. Again, it's hyper-personalization ultimately, right? When we talk about Marketo programs in Salesforce campaigns, this is another pain point that we see quite often, and why I wanted to drop it in here. Part of using the native Salesforce campaigns will help us manage and understand what attribution we have when it comes to marketing performance. So where is our success attributed to? Which campaign types? Which campaign? What was the last touch? How do we get that information? We can do much of that in Salesforce. Of course, we can do some of it in Marketo as well. Now, we need the two to talk together because we want to build a close relationship between these two systems. Now, my advice is always create your campaign from Marketo first. And I'll tell you why. Marketo pushes in a one-way direction the different statuses of your campaign. And when I talk about statuses of the campaign, I'm talking about the channels and tags. I'm talking about the progression statuses that allow you to see whether a campaign has been successful or not, because you measure a webinar different to a download, to a web page, to a press release. And if you haven't optimized or modified your channels and tags, I highly recommend to do it. We've got a couple of blog posts on it. If you want some advice, feel free to reach out to us. They really do make a huge difference. And if you haven't been using them today correctly, with manual steps to update the process, I say manual steps always when I'm thinking about smart campaigns and building them in order to say, if this, then that, you can retrofit it. So it's not lost. You can catch up with it over time. Now, I'm going to get into an example later on about parent campaigns and child campaigns, especially webinar series. And there's a gotcha here, which I'll talk to you about as well. And also we want to push cost periods, right? Cost periods are really important when we're looking at the ROI of a campaign. So let's say you've built a white paper, you've published it, you're synchronizing it into Salesforce, which is fantastic. But actually you want to know your cost per lead. You want to know the cost per success. You want to know cost of revenue. Those questions all come from the synchronization between the two platforms. So let me shut up for a second. I'm going to switch over into Marketo for some very quick fire views and demonstrations here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because my screen is huge this side. And then I'm going to just kind of walk you through these different objects. Then we'll get into some of the questions that are coming through. So first, navigate to admin, top menu, left-hand side, Salesforce, and you get the screen where you put your integration. You've, of course, got your last time that the synchronization has taken place. And here we've got the new tabs, right? Sync status and sync errors. So let me talk to you a little bit about how we use these. As you know, people who are often troubleshooting synchronization issues. The first thing you'll notice here is we start to see objects. What are we synchronizing? And you'll see I've got a few custom objects synchronizing in here. I've got campaigns, I've got opportunities, I've got contacts, etc. Now, what I'm looking for here on this list is items like this one, where I've got 10 records that I've skipped. I can now go into my database and look to find out what's happened. Or I'm looking for absolute failures, right? So I can sort on this column, and this Marketo is not keeping up with me, and see whether I've got any errors. It looks like I've been fairly lucky here on my different syncs. Now, if I want to do the quick view, I can go straight into the synchronization errors and find out what exactly is happening. Where is the issues? So as you can see, I've got a dodgy pick list entry here that I've got to go and fix. I can open up my record here, go and fix it myself, and then force it to sync again. Now, where we have the person actions on the person object, we can now do that very quickly. But again, have a look through here, see if you've got anything popping up. Cross-reference IDs is an interesting one. That's when leads are being converted at the same time as updates being pushed through. Again, watch out for those. And again, these are interesting too. We've got duplicate member of campaign. So you will start to see and hear common errors that you can then source the problem. You can find out why. Now, if you're happening to see a lot of these, as I don't like to see in my instance, you may want to go and clean up this data with the data standardization program. And if you're not familiar with those, we do have another webinar on those as well. So that's the sync part. Now let's talk about custom objects very quickly and how these hang together. Now, if you've ever gone in here and looked in the Salesforce object sync, you'll see there's a long list of different objects that sit here. These are all relationship objects with either the lead or a contact or the account. And you'll see I've got a few with little green ticks, which are my project objects. And then I've got some other items in here as well. So for example, let's say in a very vanilla world of Salesforce, we want to bring in our quote object because we want to pull in the relevant information. We must first disable the sync of our global sync and then enable the sync of that object. That means any of the quotes within Salesforce will now start to bring into Marketo, and we can start to use the information that's part of that. Now, I am just going to disable that, otherwise my marketing team will be very upset with me for changing the synchronization rules. Now, anytime you don't see an object here that's just been created, for example, you can refresh the schema. This takes a little bit of time, so I'm not going to click it in this conversation, but you can do that. Now, what I'm looking for here is any of my contacts who have a project contact role. So what is this? This, and I'll show you in the Salesforce side as well, is basically anyone who has a project in the JTF marketing CRM system, which is then associated with a person. As again, I've told you before, they must have a contact relationship or a lead relationship in order to be utilized. Now, I'm going to park that there. I'm going to switch my sync back on, not to upset anybody. Now Marketo throws me an error, which is wonderful for a demo, right? And I'm going to switch over into my CRM. So I hope you can see that on the screen now. Now I've got this dummy opportunity, and this layout may be different to yours, of course, because it's fully customizable. But I've got on the left-hand side here a project ID. Now, if I click on that project ID, I get all the information about my dummy project. It's in progress. The end date was 2020, which means it's overrun, it's over budget. It's the perfect project. But on the right-hand side here, I've got project contact roles. Now, this is a little bit specific. However, I wanted to show you this in terms of the relationship person. Now, when we go back into Marketo, we then have to look at the objects, right? So in our smart list, I'm just going to use this one that I set up before this call. And on my right-hand column, because I've added in 2 project objects, I get 2, but you'll start to see items like this, has project contact role. And these will all differ depending on how you want to use the information. So in this case, I'm looking at a contact, for those of you who are aware of the C, who has a project, means they have a project associated to them. And then I've got my constraints, which I can add in here. So whether I want to choose which account it is, when I want to choose anybody with an end date, or maybe even it's, you know, how much money have they spent? What's the status of that project? So let's say the project is in progress. And that's the information pulling through from my custom object in Salesforce. Now, I'm not going to dwell on that for too much more. If you get more questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm going to move on now to my next showcase, which is talking about structured programs, parent and child programs, and synchronization in this context. So what I've done is I've knocked together this nicely named webinar series and then badly named local assets. So please forgive me for that. We do have another webinar on naming conventions, which I should really be following, but someone will tell me off for that later. There's 2 things to be aware of when we talk about parent and child synchronization of programs into Salesforce. The first one is the parent container, this webinar series, we do want to synchronize over because that's the one that we're going to use for reporting purposes. So that's the one maybe we'll assign the budget to, we'll get the information from, et cetera, et cetera. So you've probably all seen this before, where you come in, you can choose to attach it to an existing campaign, or you can create new. As I mentioned, please try and use as much as you can the Marketo user creating the Salesforce sync campaign, as it will take over the channels and tags. Now, let me just confirm what I mean by that once I've hit save and I've got my program linked. The Marketo sync user has just gone to Salesforce to create this campaign and bring over these different program statuses, which is ultimately for our webinar series, right? Now, if you want to, for your child campaign, so your sub-webinars, let's call them, you can create another program. There's no problem with that at all. But you don't want to integrate it again to the exact same webinar, because you're going to measure these events maybe differently. You can sync it across, or you can leave it there. Now, I mentioned there was a gotcha. Here, you'll see I've got webinar EMEA, webinar LATAM in my naming convention, and they're not different topics. Now, there's a reason for that. First part is, when you're in a program, you can only be in one of these progression statuses. So now if I attend multiple events within a webinar series, I will only appear as attended once, not 3 times, only once. Now, what you might want to do is configure this in such a way, if you've got a webinar series where you have a specific channel, let's say we run 3 webinars, and then you change the status to, I have attended 1 webinar, 2 webinars, and 3 webinars. Again, complex use case, but completely possible. In this case, I want to just jump straight into the progression status and how we use them, right? So let's make the assumption that the people on my smart list, which I'm just using dummy data for, have all attended. They've all registered, sorry. They've all registered for the event. When I drag over my program status change here, I'm actually then using, as the first one, my master series. So I'm taking the parent program and saying, these people have registered for my webinar. And then I'm taking my local, and I know it's local because it's local to the program, because there's a nice little dot in here. Again, I'm going to set my local information here on this EMEA event to be webinar registered also. Pretty straightforward stuff. It is just about changing the membership status in both campaigns at once. Same will apply if I go to my LATAM event. And this time I've got an invite example. I go to my flow step. I've got change program status in the parent campaign first, invited. I then get change program status in my LATAM sub event, webinar invited. So again, what I can start to do is measure the event individually, but measure it as a whole as well. So if I want to say, we run a webinar series of 3 webinars, 1 for EMEA, LATAM, and APAC, and here's the results we got. We invited 100,000 people, 50,000 attended, etc., etc. Again, you can get that information. You can structure it in that way. As I mentioned, from the synchronization perspective, all the members who are in this parent campaign will synchronize to this Salesforce campaign. But if you really want it on a regional level as well, you can also synchronize those. So that's how you manage the parent campaigns within those objects. That's how you use custom object information in your smart list as well. And of course, you can use it for trigger based as well, which we didn't touch on, but you will have certain triggers available, you know, has been added to a project or has purchased an item, whatever it might be. There's lots of possibilities there. And again, I would advise you to talk to someone who's familiar with some of those issues. So I'm conscious of time. We're coming up to the 30-minute mark. So, you know, how can we help you? We're experts in Marketo as a platform. We're also experts in the technology that integrates with it, the likes of Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, so on and so forth. We're happy to give you advice and ideas without charging you. Please come and talk to us, and we will give you the recommendations that we can. I also highly recommend that you have a look at our website and choose a free audit. The free audit will give you an actionable roadmap, which you see on the right-hand side here, which is basically an outsider's point of view, a list of recommendations that we think you can implement in your instance to improve the way in which you're using Marketo. And importantly, there will be some upside to that, right? What is the difference? You might generate more leads, you might actually get more engagement, etc., etc. Again, we're here to support you in that process. 5 minutes over. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Any additional questions, please do get in touch. More than happy to help you. As I say, even if you get something you just want to walk through on the phone personally, happy to do that. And we see whether we can get you back on track and synchronizing all of those records. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar will be available on demand, so feel free to share it to your peers and colleagues. And of course, we hope to see you on the next one.